Oh, we had this full screen before, didn't we? So we could see their presentation a bit better.
I'll let you risk it, right?
I risked it. It worked. Relax.
Good. No, it's all
I
right.
don't think I've pressed anything.
It's kind of like it's memories of like old kind of internet dial-up days where when you get a really nice fast connection, you're downloading your rip-off MP3s or whatever, and you just kind of just walk away from the computer really slowly, and so things didn't you didn't want to get anything interrupted or trip a wire or do anything to interrupt.
All right. Well, I'm gonna say hand over Dan, and I figure you can introduce yourself. So why don't you go ahead and start?
No worries. No, thank you so much for being in the room there, Kim, and thank you everyone for coming today to join us as we talk around some work we're currently doing here within our Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making Society. So I'm Professor Daniel Angus. I'm here with Abdul Obied, who is a data engineer within our ADMS team. We're both situated here at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. And before we start, we'd also like to pay our respects and acknowledge the First Nations owners of the lands of which we conduct this research and we meet you today, which is the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. And we pay our respects to their elders past and present. So what are we going to talk through about today? And just in terms of format here, I'd say we're going to kind of move through these slides as a bit of an overview of these projects we've been doing and try and leave as much time at the end for discussion. So we're really interested in having an open, kind of panel discussion around ways in which we can think about extending these methods, other ideas you might have for your own projects, and that. So we're going to kind of skim through some of the detail and chuck any questions in Q&A as they come, and we'll get around to them. Maybe not during the prezo, but certainly towards the end. So what are we talking about? So the projects that we're interested in talking to you about today is the Australian Search Experience and the Australian Ad Observatory. So these are two discrete projects that have been running for the last 2 years within ADMS, and they're largely framed as citizen data donation projects. So they target some of the largest platforms in Google with the Search Experience and a variety of Google products, and Meta with the Australian Ad Observatory, zeroing in on Facebook advertising and the Facebook experience. The approach we're taking to these ideas and these methods is one of platform observability. So this comes out of work of Reeder and Hoffman, which goes beyond just transparency. So the idea of observability is that it actually contextualizes transparency within the systems, the social systems in which, and the material settings in which these transactions take place. So it's bringing rather than just kind of gazing at the machine as this kind of disembodied entity, it's asking questions around how do individuals experience forms of algorithmic sorting or search engine results rankings. How does it work for them as an individual, and how do we understand that as we start to move out from an individual to a whole society in terms of their experience in really kind of characterizing that how these platforms are working. How we see citizen data donation playing a really critical role here, and as an important methodology as well, is that data donation is situated. It situates in that kind of that interface between the person, the actual user of the system that we're interested in studying, and the system itself. What that provides then is rich examples. So you get a lot of very, very interesting data from that you wouldn't normally necessarily obtain if we were just using, say, APIs from the platform themselves or forms of web scraping or other things that we've done for a very, very long time in the social sciences, in gathering kind of platform data. So it's a much richer form of data when you ask the citizenry itself to donate what their experience is of these platforms. That it also means that when you situate it at the level of the citizen, it can be a lot more dynamic, because as platforms change, and they change things around the ranking of results, around the kinds of ways in which they present the platform experience to the users, these data donation methods are often pretty good at keeping up with those dynamic changes. You can also access that user vernacular around how they experience those shifts and dynamics as a platform itself changes. More than anything, though, I feel it's a much more empowered method. When we get into a lot of the discussions around the ethics of social media data gathering, a lot of the problems that come up at these when we have these discussions is because we're not involving the users first and foremost in the collection process. Whereas with citizen data donation, you're kind of putting the power back in the hands of the users and asking them to be part of a group that are empowered to try to, steer the lens back at the platform itself and make sense of what's kind of happening there. It's highly empowering for the users to be involved in this. And obviously, it's complementary. This is not something to replace all other forms of observation, transparency, and other forms of inquiry as to platforms and what they do. It's absolutely designed as a complementary approach. So Abdul's going to now talk a little bit around the design, deployment, and some of the platform responses in setting up these particular projects.
Hi, everyone. As Dan said, I'm going to talk about what went on behind the scenes of the development, deployment, and platform responses of these plugins. So one of the very first questions that we asked when we were going into the development of these plugins was, how do we make the user experience for our citizen scientists, as we like to call them, how do we make that experience as seamless as possible? What I mean by that is, how do we make the processes run smoothly so that the user is not impeded by the plugins when they run within their browsers? One of the first things then that we had to go over was the code for each of these plugins that we use to run the plugins from within the browser. With the Australian Ad Observatory, this was building off of the work of the NYU Ad Observatory, and for that purpose, we were dealing with some pre-optimized open source plugin code that was very, very easy to put into place, that had been very much made to run quickly and easily for just loading up within Facebook, and only processes data about Facebook ads. So there wasn't really much to do at the plugin level. But with respect to the Australian search experience, for sharp contrast, we wanted to implement a whole bunch of new features that went beyond, the predecessors who did this with Algorithm Watch, our collaborators of the ADMS. What we did was we decided that we wanted to query multiple platforms of Google, which includes Google News, Google Search, Google Videos, and YouTube. We wanted to query a range of keywords and spoof mobile devices. You can imagine that this is already a bunch of functionality. And so for this purpose, then what we were doing was we were iteratively going over search terms and making multiple requests to the internet. And this then put a lot of strain on computer usage. And this was something that we had to anticipate. So in the top right, I've got here a little example of one of the tests for computer usage, what it looks like for us. And in the bottom right is a worst case scenario during testing of where you might have 10 pages open up in a daemon process. That, as part of the plugin, it loads up a window that sits in the background of your web experience. And we wanted to make that seamless. So we'd avoid cases like that, which would make it difficult. So the next aspect I want to talk about in the design and development was adapting the software to various browsers. We targeted Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, and Microsoft Edge. And each of these browsers have their own constraints, limitations, and features that are contextualized to the browsers themselves. So for instance, in 2023, Google will be introducing Manifest version 3, which changes how web requests go up and down from the user's computer to the web. And this meant that, since we're using web requests in the Australian search experience, for instance, that we needed to change the API to suit the needs of the browser and to work with the browser to ensure that we're implementing the APIs in the way that they want us to implement them, so that we're providing the best experience to the user that we possibly can. So when we submit these, when we submit these plugins to the browser extension stores for distribution to the public, we need to make sure that we're following rules that are set out by these browser extension stores. This involves, firstly, not using code that could maliciously affect end users. Obviously, we don't want to have code that could, do anything to impede them. But not only beyond doing things that might be malicious, there are also accidental cases where, plugins might collect information that they're not supposed to collect. And we anticipate this, and we worked around these problems to ensure that we're only collecting what we need to collect, and that we're only behaving with the plugin in such a way that it needs to behave.
So yeah, I mean, with this particular point, we should, and I should have probably introduced this. The Ad Observatory is primarily interested in scraping Facebook ads. So ads that Facebook users encounter through their ordinary browsing experience on laptop or desktop computers. Whereas the search experience is much more around instantiating periodic searches of these products that Abdul's talking about. So, YouTube, Google search, and others, with a set key list of terms, and seeing what results actually come back to that logged in Google user. And both of these as ways to actually get a 10,000 foot view with thousands of users, hopefully, of these plugins, how that search experience is mediated for each user, and how the different ads are being targeted towards users. But fundamentally, the plugins in this case being the vehicle through which those kinds of functions can take place.
Absolutely. So yeah, in saying that, when we implemented these approaches, there were some responses that we got from the platforms, be them automated or non-automated. For example, with the Australian search experience, we found that when we were running, our daemon process in the search experience, when it queries the internet for these search terms, sometimes what would happen is that Google's automated anti-crawling response, which is shown on the left here, it would activate and check to see whether or not the user is a robot. And what we did in our testing phase was ensure that we throttle these requests so that it's behaving organically, so that we're not regularly, we're not over-pinging, Google Search or Google News or any other platform that we're accessing, that we're not pinging them irregularly to generate responses like that from within the user's browser. For contrast then with Facebook, Facebook, as you know, when we're conducting data donations from within the Facebook newsfeed, these advertisements that are displayed on the newsfeed are part of Facebook's source of income, and you can imagine that they have mechanisms to prevent ad blockers from blocking the ads that are shown to users from within this environment. So as part of that, they obfuscate the text that is shown on the screen. When you see an advertisement, the very indicators of the advertisement, like for instance, the sponsored text that sits beneath it, that's actually at the computer code level. That is jumbled up and made obscure to automated techniques like our data donation process. And so what we've had to do is we've had to implement methods to get around that. Unfortunately, there are other individuals who are affected by this. A byproduct is of this particular obfuscation technique that Facebook is implementing is that people who use screen readers, like individuals who are blind, they are also impacted by this obfuscation. And Facebook has pushed back and has stated that they believe that here's an article on the right by Mike Clark, the product management director of Facebook, stating that they don't provide this data to us. They on account of the fact that it might compromise privacy. However, we believe that there is some confusion here. As Dan mentioned before, we don't collect anything except the advertisements when we gather them. So this is something that we make very clear in the purpose of our plugin.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, the legal pushback that colleagues at NYU have received at this. We haven't had any negative responses from either of these platforms through our own work, which is quite interesting. And within the NYU case, I don't believe that anything more has come of this. Outside of the overt legal threats and removal of privileges to many members of that research team in terms of blocking of their access to the Meta platform and all corresponding Meta services.
So now going on to the data pipeline. Within the pipeline itself, we want to make sure, firstly, that the user data is something that we only gather what we need, and we're very clear about what we do gather. So as part of our research project's purpose, we gather demographic data, and we only gather indicators of demographic data that can be used to identify demographic patterns. So, for instance, things like gender, location, down to postcode only. We don't gather things like names or email addresses because we don't perceive that those have any need with respect to demographic patterns. But this is all de-identified and it's sent up to a cloud server infrastructure. The only thing that is retained on the user's computer is a credential, which takes the form of a hash key. And this is to ensure, because we cannot, we cannot lock down individuals' computers, we don't store any local information about the user's demographic data on the user's computer itself.
Yeah, and as part of that ethical process and the ethical clearance we have to do this, absolutely no identifying or re-identifying information is allowed. And we're very careful, like in cases, particularly those where you may have a postcode and particular demographic data, which when combined may, limit the number of possible people in that area, that would be very careful about that kind of level of data and how that would then be used, say in public releases of data we gather through these techniques. So yeah, absolutely, re-identification risk is something we take seriously.
So once you have a user credential, you can begin your data donation acquisition process, which is when a user submits a data donation, this then goes up to our cloud infrastructure, and that forms the front end of what is essentially an ETL pipeline, an extract, transform, and load up pipeline, where firstly the data is acquired from that front end, and then what goes through is a transformation and analysis process, which will go into more depth in about a second. But from that, what happens is that the data is stored in an online database that we can then query for important information about that data. Just as a side note here, we secure everything inside our cloud infrastructure behind an identity access management framework, and that includes the servers, schedulers, diagnostics, databases, and API gateways. Everything is only accessible by individuals who have the appropriate clearances, and once they have those clearances, members of our research team can then go in and access that data, and this is done to ensure that individuals who might have malicious incentives, they don't have access to it, and that it doesn't go into the wrong hands.
All right, so participant recruitment. This is one of the critical, limitations of data donation, is that you're completely reliant on trying to excite and energize a community to download and use these particular plugins within their everyday browsing experience. A fundamental limitation I will get to at the end as well is that at the moment we're only talking about web-based, plugins as well. So that kind of eliminates the mobile area, which is something that we'll pick up towards the end. But really, how do we energize and get this out to as many people? If we want to make claims around Google search and the potential for particular bias within that towards certain news organizations, or we want to test ideas around Facebook, advertising, targeting, particular vulnerable groups with particular problematic advertising for, say, gambling or financial products and services that are problematic. How do we actually go about making sure that those individuals are signed up and part of that particular team? So a large part of this is leveraging traditional media. We've got within ADMS, we're lucky, it's a very large center, very well resourced, and we've got some fabulous people working with us, such as Kathy Nichols, who's dedicated as someone who's an outreach and engagement officer. And so Kathy has done the work, essentially getting the word out there into the hands of not just the media, but other community organizations, advocacy organizations, so those who are already interested in issues of transparency and such when it comes to the platform ecosystems, and getting them the message out there. So once Abdul has done all the hard work building this amazing infrastructure, getting the actual plugins submitted onto those app stores, then the work really happens to try and get that into as many hands as possible. So some of the success we've had here is because I think the kinds of projects we're doing here speak to contemporary issues that are of concern to our citizenry. People know about things like advertising online. Everyone's had an experience of an ad that they've got that they feel is a little bit maybe creepy, that I was talking about this thing and then all of a sudden I saw this ad over here. So how do we lock onto those concerns and not kind of, not to say exploit them, but how do we make sure that we connect and go, well, look, if you're concerned about this, then you might be interested in forming part of this citizen science collective so we can know more about it. is this really a thing? Is this a thing at scale? And how does your experience compare with that of other Australians or indeed, other people around the world? So that's part of the strategy here, I think, is locking on to a contemporary concern and saying, look, you can be part of the solution to this if you want to come on board this particular project. So for us as well, I mean, there's two stories really here. The search experience, which is that one on the right, got some really good press within, national news organizations like the ABC here and others. We wrote conversation articles and many more. A lot of its uptake was through that kind of community grassroots take up. So a lot of really, really hard work in small to kind of medium-sized organizations, getting it in their newsletters, their mail outs and such to convince people to sign up. And so the sign-up rate for that was fairly kind of linear and organic. Whereas what helped the ad experience was we recently just had our Australian federal election. This is a national election, and it's something that does dominate the news cycle for the kind of 6-week period that it takes place over. Fortunately, colleagues at ABC were very interested in what we were doing. And so we partnered with ABC here, and they invited me onto their national news programs, ran heaps of articles, and got this thing under the nose of all of Australia, really. And we saw our enrollments go from around 150 to 200, almost to 2,000 within the space of a few weeks during that political campaign. So I guess the message here is that with these donation approaches, try to lock on to a contemporary event or something that's going to really elevate the profile of your donation tool and your project as much as possible. And don't be afraid to try to, I guess, get it out there in the media. And of course, you've got to put the work in yourself to front up and kind of try and do your best in front of that global or national news audience as well. But another part of that and selling that message is there has to be a value add to the participants. That principle of reciprocity at the heart of this is so, so important. And so, for example here, the Australian Ad Observatory, any participant who's downloaded that plugin gets access to an archive of their ads. So they can see here the ads that they've encountered, why they've been targeted with those. And as this project progresses, we're going to keep adding more and more features to this, like, comparison tools so they can compare their experience to other people in the database, de-identified, of course. So, show me ads that other people like me have seen, these kinds of things to really try and add that value back to participants. So, they're getting something out of sharing their data with us other than just that, kind of warm, fuzzy feeling of being part of something which is going to help science and research in general. So on to analysis. Abdul.
Yeah. So we have analytical methods that come in after the data acquisition process. With the Australian search experience and with the Ad Observatory, these are framed by the research questions. And the research question that we were asking in the Australian search experience was, firstly, well, how do search engines personalize the search experience? And then from that, how do search results rank for a given search term? And how do we compare search results between different demographics? So on the left here, I have just a standard page that comes out of Google search that's got, search results that are ranked. And on the right, I have a rank flow visualization, which is a visualization technique that then enables us to understand how, given over a period of time, these search results might change in how they are ranked, within that particular search platform. So that there is, it enables us to then answer that question, bring it back to the purpose of the research to try and understand, how are these search results ranking. And we did this not only for Google search, but also for Google News, videos, and YouTube. And you can see already that there are some interesting differences between these that we document further up at the ADMS site.
Yeah, so certainly like in this one, colleague Axel Bruins has done a lot of work along with us and others in the team, James Meese and others, to really kind of dig into these results now, which are incredibly illuminating in those questions, even for like comparisons between different Google services and particularly across different kinds of queries. So each one you're seeing here is related to a particular keyword. In this case, the Google News rank flow there is around the Uluru statement, which is a contentious in some ways, absolutely warranted and justified in others, process around Indigenous reconciliation in Australia right now. And, for something like that, it's interesting to see how, like, what news sources are present and how they're changing in terms of their ranking and prominence over time for that singular keyword.
So then also with the Australian Ad Observatory, once again, we start with a research question. And the question here was, how do we hold Facebook advertisers accountable? And this is a pretty broad question. There are analyses in the past that have attempted to do this. What's interesting in our work is that we've taken it to image analysis, and we're really focused here on analyzing the image data that's being served on Facebook. This goes beyond just simply the text that sits around the post, but actually into the image itself. What are the different ways that we can establish meaning from these images that are being served to users on the Facebook newsfeed? So OCR, object detection, and logo detection are some particular techniques that are given here that constitute some of the ways in which we're piecing this data apart. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about logo detection. So we implement a machine learning YOLO logo detection method. YOLO stands for You Only Look Once, which is essentially enables us to, where we've got hundreds upon thousands of images coming in with these data donations, we want to be able to very quickly and very easily determine where logos appear within these images. And as Dan mentioned, during the Australian federal election, we undertook some analysis on ads that were relating to the federal election. And here's an example. I've got here a logo that corresponds to one particular political party, and we have a process then that goes into trying to detect that logo. So what we do firstly is we strip the logo down just to the insignia. We get different angles of this logo, from rotation, scalation, skewings, and then we train a convolutional neural network to sort of get an idea about what the logo looks like in different synthesized environments, so that it can then, given future cases, generalize what that logo looks like under all these different images. So then there's a training process. We run tests. And at the very end of it all, on the right, you can see here that we've got an in the wild image that is a real advertisement image that was served on Facebook. Our logo detection technique was able to find out where the logo for this political party was within that image, so that we can figure out that, hey, this belongs to this political party.
And why this kind of analytics is important in a project like this, particularly around political advertising, is a potential for forms of advertising which are adversarial in nature. So, in Australia, we don't have truth in advertising laws in most of the country. And so what that means is that there can be, actors which adopt and appropriate the logos of oppositional parties and use them in their own forms of advertising. And some of those forms of ads can then, go through undetected. So Facebook's own ad transparency library only indexes, declared political and issue advocates. So, declared political parties are meant to register their interest that they are going to be using, forms of political advertising on the platform. And from there on, declare that every, post is or isn't one of these political advertisements. But, as we've seen in the past, it doesn't stop some, malicious actors from also engaging in political messaging. And so the idea here behind logo detection and some of the other OCR and object detection was to try and detect in this stream of ads that are coming in. Because remember, these processes we're getting people to install, they're not actually involved in the process manually. It detects an ad and sends it automatically into the server. And so, with that process being quite automatic, we generate a huge volume of ads, many of which have nothing to do with politics. And so if you're wanting to kind of carve out just those that relate to that election that we've just had, we need these kinds of processes there to try and, detect that bycatch, right, of ads that may not be properly declared or listed on the official sites. That said, in our analysis of the election as it just happened, fortunately, we didn't detect any of this. We did detect a couple of ads, though, that were from undeclared sources. So they were trying to promote like kind of an astroturfing style campaign, but nothing, overtly kind of like hate speech or such was detected. All right, so that's a pretty rapid fire intro into those two projects and that whole kind of idea around data donation. There's a whole bunch of links here that I'll leave on the screen for a little bit, so you can have a look at this and take notes. The ad observatory and the search experience, all the information in terms of how many participants, the sign up, that whole process, all the media that's been generated around those are all documented there on our ADMS Centre website. I will put a shout out as well to a white paper that was recently released on the search experience. That includes a lot more of that justification around the methodology. Axel's done a great overview of the project and its genesis. Also talking to, obviously, partners in Algorithm Watch there, who I've listed them as well. Ad Observatory, so that's the NYU Ad Observatory. So you can have a look at their work, their responses to the threats from Facebook as well. And all the code. So all of the code for this is situated up at GitHub under our ADMS Center GitHub account. These are two of our flagship kind of projects at the moment. So you're going to find lots of helpful resources there and much of that code, which is extended work of partners there. And this is us giving it back out there. So look, with that all said, we'd love to hear reflections, thoughts, questions from you in the room of anything that we've covered. And if you want us to go back in detail over anything that we've skimmed over, more than happy to kind of take those questions and expand further.
Dan, I see we have one question in the Q&A while people in the room are thinking about what questions they might have, from Nick Dowes, which is, why do you think the project has managed to avoid any adverse or NYU-style reactions from the platforms?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, Nick, because I often ask myself this same question. Look, I think there's a couple of possible answers, and this is just me speculating more than anything, and is that Australia is a very different part of the world, right, to America. I think if you're a massive university like NYU and you're doing this, you're going to attract a lot of attention, and Facebook felt the need to respond to that in a similar way that all that's gone down there between, say, for example, Christian Sandvig's work on auditing and that famous Sandvig v. Sessions case, and this other kind of machinations within the States have led to a situation with it's quite adversarial, I think. Australia is different, right? Currently as well in Australia, I mean, they've been toying around with a lot of very interesting regulation against the platforms, right? Or which is seen to be kind of anti-platform. So the News Media Bargaining Code is the one that I've written about with others as well who are involved in ADMS and the project. The News Media Bargaining Code, for those who are not aware, was a piece of legislation that was set up whereby the Australian government can designate a tech platform, which means that if they're designated, they have to do certain or comply with certain kinds of regulations. To avoid being designated, the company has to essentially bargain with news providers to provide a revenue share from the platform back to those news organizations. So it's almost like a rent seeking for the news organizations from the big tech platforms. Now, myself and other scholars have criticized the regulation itself as being ill-founded and not really fit for purpose. But nonetheless, I think the feeling on the ground here is that the platforms may not want to prod the bear too much. That, if they start coming after these approaches in a similar way they have in America, they may just find themselves in a worse position in terms of, people going, well, hang on, why isn't there greater accountability and transparency in what they're doing? Surely like this is something that they would welcome and not try and fight back against. So whether there's been a conversation there that says, look, let them do their thing. It's probably, they're probably not going to see too much. I mean, in the case of Google anyway, largely our results fit with their narrative. Google search doesn't vary that much. I mean, Google have said themselves quite publicly, they don't do a lot of hardcore filtering of search results based on people's personas on the platform. And actually our results confirm that. So in some ways, I think it's in their interest for us to be out there doing this, because our analyses confirm their public statements in many ways. So yeah, I guess that's an answer of sorts, but yeah, I guess we're lucky in many ways that we haven't, been targeted in the same way that the NYU researchers, because I will say it's not been nice, I guess, to be one of those researchers. Having chatted with Laura and others, their personal accounts have all been taken away from them. To be kind of left out in the cold by the platforms with no real right of reply is pretty bad.
Can I ask,
go ahead.
Can I ask a follow-up, Dan, which is having done research projects through the university system and through ethics approval and all of those sorts of things, did you get much pushback from the universities about the potential legal risk involved in all of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. At QT, at least, they've done a good job, and I think this is down to people like Jean Burgess and Axel Bruins and others that have really tried to educate the ethics committees around the differentiation between ethical risk to participants and legal risk to the university, and trying to kind of keep the ethical process very much centered on the participants and potential risks to them. And certainly we had to discuss it. We had to talk about a strategy of what could happen. But as the last couple of years have shown us, nothing's happened adversely in terms of that. And we did strategize a little bit about whose name appears on what public materials and these kinds of things as well. But yeah, and of course there are others that we've consulted with, some people I can't mention here, but some who've certainly provided good advice there as well. But yeah, I think we've done a good job here at least of differentiating ethics from like kind of organizational institutional risk, which is something I can't say for all universities in Australia or indeed elsewhere.
Go on, question from the room.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the topic of the pushback from companies. I was wondering if it is technically or possible to have the platform not detect that the user has the plugin, because otherwise you could have something like the Volkswagen scandal, where Volkswagen's car knew when they were in test mode, and then they changed the level of emissions that they would have during the test. And in Europe, for instance, they found out years after that they had widespread use of those cars with large amounts of emissions that remained undetected for that reason. I don't know if you heard of that scandal, but I guess you see what I mean.
Yeah, I couldn't hear completely, but is a question around when the users download the plugin, how it may differ, like the plugin itself, how much that is different from their authentic experience? Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. Yeah, my voice is anyway really low. So no, it's not about the difference in plugins. It's that let's say if you use this approach as a tool for regulation, where you try to see, for instance, if some platform are discriminatory or infringe on privacy or something. If the platform can detect when a user has your plugin, then it can change its behavior. And that's what happened with Volkswagen when they changed the emission of the car when it was in test mode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, Abdul, do you want to talk to that one?
Yeah, so we've, as much as we possibly can, we've made it such that these plugins behave in such a way that the platforms cannot detect them. I don't say that, that we're fully certain about this, because there are methods that may extend beyond, what I've intentionally coded into, heuristic techniques or techniques that might not even be known yet that the platforms can implement. There is a disclaimer on our work, obviously, that when we implement this, we do so with the understanding that given that we try to cover up as much of our trail as we can to make this as organic as an experience as possible for the user, that the platform doesn't anticipate that that we're gathering this data, because we believe that in good intent, but there is such cases where the platform may actually, based on the knowledge that the plugin is present, change what they're showing to certain users. And we don't rule it out, but we have taken steps to ensure that, when executing web requests, that we do so such in a way that it would take place if the user was doing it without the plugin. We're leaving very, 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 very thin trails of activity. There's almost no digital footprint at all on the plugin code, so that when it runs, the browser itself can't interact with it in a way to determine, for the platform's sake, whether or not it is installed.
Yeah. The one thing I'll add on to that as well is it's a really good point you raised, though, in that a lot of the thinking around this, we've had to be very conservative in our approach, particularly when it came to the search experience, because with search experience, it's quite an active process in that it's instantiating these searches across the various Google platforms against a whitelist of keywords. And so the keyword list that we have, which has about, about 30 to 50? 30 to 50 key terms. We're certainly not picking terms that are potentially problematic, right? So we're not searching for things like QAnon or other kinds of, potentially quite dangerous or ideas, because this process is initiating it on the user's own machine, and that will appear in their Google search history. So if there is any chance that their future search activity, their YouTube recommendation algorithms or such would be impacted negatively and start to push them towards, say, radicalization materials, then we would absolutely not want that to happen. And so we've had to be quite conservative in the terms we're searching for, to make sure that they are things that are generally topical. COVID-19, it's a pretty generic search term now. Now, in the past, they themselves may have searched for, say, anti-vax information, but searching on COVID-19 is not going to necessarily push them one way or the other on that, because it's quite a neutral term to search for. But one thing we are tracking is, given we have those hashes, we can see to what extent, after successive similar searches by a user, is this process itself starting to actually interfere with the machine in terms of how Google presents results back. Like, are we starting to see users pushed into a corner in terms of their search ranking starting to flatline or something, because they're searching the same stuff every other day thanks to this plugin? What weirdness might that be having in terms of their other Google search rankings and such? But yeah, hopefully that's a bit of an answer in terms of both the like Abdul's points, and then also the considerations around what you do with the user's control of that search.
Thanks, Dan. We have another question from the Q&A, which is, what aspects of transparency are definitely something better off considered remaining hidden as part of the model implementation?
Right. So yeah, I mean, going back to the point, I think if I've got this question right, is that how we implement the plugins and our backend analysis and such. I mean, one thing is absolutely clear, is that user privacy and such is absolutely critical. So that demographic data that we collect over ranges, not defined. So when we ask for age, we're asking for an age range. We're asking only postcode level, not address level data. We're being very careful around the user side of this in terms of what they provide. I don't think there's anything that we consider off limits in terms of, I mean, the ad observatory is pretty well defined in terms of only collecting the ads themselves, the why am I seeing this tags, and any other data that Facebook can provide. I don't think there's anything there that would be concerning for us to collect that, or that we wouldn't want to know about to illuminate around how that system works itself. And I think the same, could be said for Google. It very much is use this user's logged in profile to access that search, return the rankings, and evaluate them. Given that we don't know who they are, we can evaluate the search return quite comfortably within the limits of those demographics. So in mine, I'm having trouble thinking of any areas that I would consider off limits. Unless Abdul, you want to?
If I might just add to this, with regards to model implementation, we're very fortunate that our machine learning approaches are only exercised on data that is not presented by the user themselves, but is part of public data sets that Facebook, issues out as part of their advertising. So, we're fortunate that we don't compromise user data in that aspect, and that nothing that is that the user would want to keep hidden is given out when we're running those implementations.
Yeah, I think it's a consideration though for future data donation projects, right? This is a really good question for that, because fundamentally the objects of inquiry here, as Abdul says, is ads which are designed as public, right? These ads are paid for, put on a platform to be seen by an audience, right? So this is in itself, defined public. Although the questions that it raises is around this new advertising space where it's actually not fully public, right? That those ads are only seen by certain kinds of people. But still, that's very different from a status update from a cousin or auntie or uncle, that we definitely would not want to see that. And that's very much, off limits user personal private data. And so I think you'd have to think really carefully around issues of consent there when it came to people donating data that's not their own, but actually someone else's authentic data. So, if they were sharing, their Instagram feed, for example, which would then actually not be sharing their own Instagram data as much as it's sharing other people's Instagram data that they are seeing as part of their feed, which may include private data. So that's where I think you've got to think really carefully about that line of presumed publicness of the data itself.
Hello. First, thanks for the presentation. I'm Olaf Lamberts from KAIS and ADA-WTH Aachen. So 2 short questions, one regarding the methodology first. Did you have any hypotheses before you collected any data, or was it basically that you collected the data and then looked at, do we find any interesting patterns in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So we didn't pre-register hypotheses. However, we did have some initial, there's plenty of work out there in particularly journalism studies around news recommendation. And there is a tendency there that with some of those other studies that have come before us around the nature of news recommendation. So we had some initial ideas and other literature that we were hoping to kind of, springboard off to test at a much more fine-grained level. Because a lot of those other approaches have used personas, like artificially created personas, in order to do this or explore ideas around, say, news personalization. And a lot of them, when they do that, the results that they obtain are obviously tainted with that, well, how perfect is that persona? How good a job have you done of trying to create this kind of artificial person? And so with, almost 2,000 logged in users on that search experience, we've just presented work in the last month showing that news personalization absolutely trends towards established media. So there were questions we had around, to what extent is Google's news search pushing towards what we consider established media or fringe media? So established media in Australia are things like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Murdoch Press, so news.com and these, and Fairfax, Channel 7, Channel 9, and these others. So, the ones which, if it's in England, it's the BBC and Sky News and those. So established media versus fringe media, like, other kind of indie media, or even in case of some, fake news and other false kind of those hyper-partisan outlets. Our results absolutely show that there is a tendency towards establishment media, which is in line with other studies that have come before it. So in some cases, that confirmed hypotheses that we'd had around what is going to be recommended. In terms of the ad observatory, we also had some initial ideas around trying to find ads that were going to target disproportionately certain products against certain demographic characteristics. So particularly gender being an important distinguishing factor, And the other one that we're still investigating is whether at-risk populations, so those like, for example, Indigenous populations in Australia or those in lower economic brackets are being targeted with problematic products in the finance space or in gambling and other problematic industries. So we had some ideas going in of things we wanted to look for, but these are quite open-ended. The data sets you obtain lead to lots of other questions being able to be drawn out. And I will also say on this as well, part of this is, I think, even within our centre, is trying to expand the imagination of the researchers in terms of what data it's possible to obtain. Because I think that sometimes we limit ourselves in the kinds of questions and hypotheses that we create because we've not had access to, geniuses like Abdul and others who can create these amazing plugins and systems to collect this kind of data. And so we don't know the kinds of questions we can ask going in because they've never seen data of this scale or of this type before. So I think part of the exercise is also capturing and expanding the imagination of the research community in terms of what questions now can be asked with these or similar kinds of donation style approaches.
Okay, thanks for that. The other regards the personal archive that you create. Is it in any way possible for you to basically track back who a particular archive belongs to, or is it like stored locally on the user's machine or so?
Yeah, Abdul.
Yep. So there are the archive that a user has is entirely local to them. However, it's de-identified. So this is something that it's the demographic data that is attached to the user is not stored on the machine itself. That there is up on the cloud infrastructure, and the ad archive for that user is something that is simply stored just as the ads themselves that have already been presented from within the browser are then really the only thing that is stored from within that local archive. We do have in adjacency to that a more comprehensive archive that is situated within the cloud infrastructure. However, what we're hoping for is in future to have a public data set that will emerge from the research that we can demonstrate insights of our research with.
Yeah.
So you archive locally and one in the cloud.
Yep. So so clarifying yours.
That one in the cloud. Is there do you use a hash to ensure that the particular archive belongs to one person, or with that I know it's a technical question, but if I understood it correctly, the hash is calculated over the demographic data?
No, the hash is not calculated using an input of the demo data, no. So the hash is a unique one-off hash that is created completely randomly at the point at which they submit the demographic data. Yeah, sorry. So no, the hash is not calculated from some combination of input. The hash is completely unique, generated at that sign-up time.
I'm aware of that question though, because I know that sometimes what will happen is that from a password, for instance, you might do an MD5 hash, and it's a different technology, but also pretty good for its own uses.
Yeah, just thanks.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. You presented an interesting case of, in a way, passive data donation. So a concerned citizen installs a plugin, and then basically they forget about it. But for you, it still does what you wanted to do. Have you considered, or have you do you plan to adapt it to a more of an active case where a user has to do more than just install a plugin? And I'm particularly interested on whether that would work in the Australian context, or maybe the same people who downloaded the plugin, would they be more willing to do that?
That's a fabulous question. I feel like that's what we call a Dorothy Dixer, right? Because that's exactly where we're moving now. Is to that area of active donation. So yeah, thank you so much. There's one I can give you that's very concrete. So the ad observatory. One really interesting aspect of the ad observatory is, yeah, as you say, it's very passive. So as users load their Facebook, they encounter advertising, it packages and sends it straight up. But what's really interesting to many researchers here, particularly thinking of colleagues like Jean Burgess and others, is accessing the user vernacular around why that they feel that ad was recommended to them. Right? It's a really interesting question here because there are actually critical questions coming from digital media scholars who study this, who study online advertising, around actually just how good it is. I think there's a lot of assumptions that have been made in the last little while around how good targeted advertising actually is. And many users we speak to talk about how terrible the ads they get are. I mean, I think of myself, right? I refrain from eating animal products. I've been, vegan for 14 years, and I get recommended steak houses, and I'm like, this is not good. Like, this is a really bad algorithm, right? And so something in the ad observatory we've thought around is when people go into that archive or in some other way of giving them the possibility of adding some kind of contextual information to help understand that experience of ads. Now, this could be done a bit differently. It doesn't have to be part of this style of donation project we have right now. We could do it in a much kind of more targeted way. You could run focus groups where you say, all right, bring everyone together, download the archive, like the ads plugin, go away for a couple of weeks, browse Facebook as you would, and we're going to bring you back. And now we're actually going to discuss and get you to go through your profile using things like, there's methods called scroll back, which do this really well of getting people to scroll through their social media feed and narrate it. You could do something similar with the archive, or it could be quite programmatic and actually have people just, do it online. When they go in, they can add extra enrichment around the ad itself. But absolutely, we're thinking, how do we get the participants back involved in that to give more insights into their experience of this? And similarly with the search experience, there's some really interesting other projects happening right now when it comes to other platforms like Spotify and others that are doing forms of ranking. So, others, researchers like I'm thinking Janula and Damiano, who are in our center as well, are playing around with, ways in which users can maybe take hold of the controls of the ranking a little bit and try that and say, well, actually, I want to dial up the traditional media, or I want to dial down the traditional media and get more of the fringe media in my Google News feed, and actually try and think creatively around how we can bring the user into that experience of algorithms and algorithmic shaping to see how they might want this tuned. So what they're doing for Spotify right now is really interesting because they've got a middleware process between Spotify's API and the user, where they give those dials and say, dial up the local content in my feed versus the generic kind of mainstream content, and see how much people react to that. Is that a good feed? Is it a bad feed? So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are ways we can imagine these in a much more active way.
Dan, I noticed we're at time, but we do have two more questions in the room. If I could just impose on you.
We're happy to take them if you guys are happy to stick around.
Great. If anyone needs to leave, obviously you should feel free to do so. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. My name is Nina, University of Cambridge. Thank you for the presentation. It's a fantastic initiative with a lot of potential, I think. So I'm interested in the search experience. You mentioned that you used these key terms and looked at them over time and whether they changed, and just kind of confirmed the companies claiming that it doesn't really change over time. But you also mentioned that they have to be kind of neutral to not have a negative experience or effect on the user's future search term, like searches. And do you think that the trend that you observed, that it doesn't change, is a fact because of the neutral key terms that you use potentially? Is that like a potential threat to your claim?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's one that we've kind of really wrestled with as well. I mean, in saying neutral, it's not that we're avoiding anything that has political valence. One of the search terms we have used is something like critical race theory. So we are searching for things that have got political valence. It's just that we're avoiding those that are absolutely overtly going to push people into potentially problematic areas. And the one platform I will single out is YouTube. Right, YouTube has been shown through lots of pieces of work of doing a very, very bad job of pushing people into some pretty radical content, pretty quickly. And so, yeah, that's the one that we're most concerned around. But yeah, I take your point. It's something we're still wrestling with: is to what extent is it the term that you're using that's kind of informing what changes or doesn't. We are cycling the terms as well to try and broaden. So we start with a whitelist of 30 to 50, but they have been cycled through at certain points of time as well. One of the interesting early findings is that topical news terms are obviously highly dynamic. So the search results change quite a lot, obviously, when something's coming into the news. So, prior to 2019, we hadn't heard of, like, COVID was a bit of an interesting one. And then all of a sudden it becomes a thing, right? And now it's settled down, actually, in terms of its rankings. So there's an interesting dynamic process at work there when new terms emerge and how that affects the ranking as well. But yeah, it's a limitation of sorts, because we don't have access to Google and can search millions of search terms to know how this works.
Okay, hello, my name is Inha from KAIS. And first of all, thank you for the awesome presentation. And what I wanted to ask was that for diagnostics database, it said that only individuals who have the appropriate clearlessness can access to the database, but could you give any particular examples of the appropriate clearlessness that was examined or was set in advance?
So, yeah, Abdul,
did you say particular examples of particular clearances that a researcher can be given to access the databases? Did you want me to give an example of that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So, for instance, I'm the lead engineer on this project. So I have not only access to all the databases, but also the schedulers that run the data, the data enrichment processes, the analytical techniques, the acquisition processes, and the transformation scripts that run up in our cloud infrastructure. I have access to all of that. We have collaborative researchers across different centers that also might want to access the data, but you can imagine that there isn't any reason why one particular researcher might need to have access to a scheduler that is scheduled to run an enrichment process that's supposed to happen, let's say, every single day. And so there's a thought process that goes into before we even give someone access to the database. Well, firstly, we ask, well, what is it exactly the purpose that this particular agent has with respect to accessing this data? And if we were to give them this clearance for this this particular resource, how does it address that purpose? In saying that, also, are there any clearances that the person has been given that they shouldn't be given? And we ask these questions to ensure that worst cases don't take place, where the infrastructure gets damaged, or someone sees something that they shouldn't see, or or plays with an infrastructure or breaks an infrastructure that that we're trying to keep running. Those are some examples of one particular group requiring certain permissions and another having others.
And one very practical example, and then I'll let everyone go because I know you must be hungry, is so for the Ad Observatory, for example, we provide a web-based interface for researchers to be able to go in there and look through all the ads that have been donated. But the thing that's missing from that is the user hashes, right? For example, that are provided to users. They can search on and filter by demographic data, but they don't get access to the hash. And so, certain things that we remove from access, because why would they need that hash, right? They're only interested in show me all the ads that have been seen by, female presenting members of the public between ages 25 and 35 in this range of postcodes, right? That's the kind of query they want to run. And so just give them that. Don't give them access, exactly as Abdul says, to schedulers or to any other back-end database infrastructure. It's just a simple front end that they can do their kind of qualitative or quantitative analysis of the kinds of ads that are in there, and think really carefully around who gets access. That is password protected, obviously, is rotating access as well. So we periodically check to see who's accessed, how long for, and whether we need to think about revoking access for members. So yeah, absolutely great question though, and something always at the front of our mind.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for beaming in.
No worries, guys. Thank you so much. And promise me someone there, because I won't get to do it myself in person. Enjoy some really nice tteokbokki or some really, really like fire hot, amazing Korean food while you're there, because that's the one thing I wanted to chow down on when I was there. But enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll see some of you in the virtual chats, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mila. Thank you. Well, that's middle.
Do we leave?
Hmm?
Do we leave?
I think we just leave, don't we? Yeah.
Leave or leave?
Oh.
I meant
I
click
assume
the
we just
leave
leave
button
it.
on the website and not the. I mean, it's.
Oh, what's the risk
bad.
now, really? If you leave, you'll have to request again.